Thinking outside the box. You've all been asked to do this at one point or another. In most cases, the request was made by a teacher. Perhaps a hip, cool, how do you do, fellow kids kind of teacher who wants you to think creatively. But only if your creative thinking aligns with whatever slightly unorthodox method he's trying to teach. But of course, you just want the lesson to end, so you make half-hearted guesses. And when he shoots those down, you stare at him, blank-faced, unchanged, and uninterested, until he reverts to the original proper lesson plan, forsaking his attempt to teach you a concept or method that wasn't any better than the original way, just different from it. Outside of the box thinking generally isn't any better than in the box thinking, at least for me. I've stood outside the box, I've scaled its surface, measured its dimensions, and I gotta say, the exterior isn't all that great. Its surfaces aren't especially conductive or higher thought. More abstract thought, maybe. But who's to say abstraction is inherently superior? I carry this belief in regards to the methodology of thought for 23 years, right up until the incident with the gunman. And, of course, my observation of the man that this tale is ultimately about. A good example of out-of-the-box thinking, not being more than a repacking of stupid thinking, is the incident that landed me in the hospital with 2 gunshot wounds to the thigh and stomach. A couple surgeries and a small fortune in prescriptions later, I'm mostly fine. I sometimes, more often than not, actually walk with a limp, and a soft tap to the gut will make me wince, but otherwise I can climb stairs and pass gas with the best of them. How I received those gunshot wounds is more interesting than how I've since received them, so I'll move on to that. Only a true outside-of-the-box thinker, a true creatively minded imbecile, would think to rob a video store. A dying video store. A video store that still sold copies of RoboCop and Terminator on VHS. A video store that had survived the near complete extinction of its kind by reducing all its prices by truly embarrassing degrees. By being operated by a single employee, its sole owner. And by the frequent patronage of people like me. People who like physical media, who enjoy buying physical media, and who may or may not have large amounts of free time due to social life devoid of socializing. People who spend their abundant free time watching movies that no one has discussed, with any real conversational substance for about 2 decades. So when I was standing in an aisle before the dusty cases of the insert your pre-2000s creature of choice, browsing for something to watch and obsessively analyzing over the weekend, I was fairly surprised when the entrance bell rang, and a man wielding a fearsome-looking shotgun entered the store. He wore a black leather jacket, jeans that looked as old as the movies I'd been standing by, and a ski mask that might have been stolen from a 90s heist movie prop bin. The gun, however, looked new, as if prior to arriving at the decision to rob a movie store, he somehow lifted a Remington from a gun shop. The store owner, a man in his 50s who moved and reacted like a man in his 70s, turned to the newly arrived thief and sighed. I felt that. I echoed it in my own way. It was a sigh that said, as if life wasn't already shit enough. I was fonder of the store than pretty much anything else in my life, so I had about as much stake in its existence as the owner who relied upon its meager business for putting food on his table. I don't know what you call it, the shakedown, the stick-up. Let's call it a robbery, even though nothing was actually stolen. The robber, or the gunman, waved the shotgun around, demanding money in a voice that sounded both impatient and bored, agitated by the inconvenience that robbing someone imposed upon his ordinarily straightforward lifestyle, maybe. The owner went through the responsive motions slowly, lethargically, as if half hoping to receive a chest full of buckshot just to be free from renting out movies to the same handful of people day by day. I watched, unheeded by the gunman and forgotten by the store owner, while still cradling movie cases in my arms. I'd never witnessed a moment of serious crime before, so no thoughts of heroism or even self-preservation came to mind. I was merely captivated by the awe of it. I would eventually be terrified, rendered speechless by the horror of an unexplainable, barely comprehended sight. But in that initial moment, I was simply shocked. When the few dollars that had been in the register were placed upon the counter, and both men in this unfortunate situation had physically expressed their dissatisfaction with the transaction, the robber began his rounds, moving through the store looking for anyone who might have had wallets full of money, or anything that added to his pathetic haul from the register. I didn't catch on to this in time, however, being shocked by the admittedly uninteresting first phase of the thievery, so I didn't move, and the robbers soon became aware of my presence and demanded that I empty my pockets. I gave him what I had, and I saw that disappointed grimace up close. If I had been born with a slightly thicker spine, or balls that were a bit heavier, I might have said something along the lines of, "If I had money, why would I be shopping here?" But I kept my mouth shut and obeyed his order. A half-articulated grunt, really, to stay in the aisle while he continued patrolling the others. The sun shone directly into the store, not inhibited by storefront signs or stickers. The movies, as a result, were faded, making them look older than they already were. My shadow was laid upon the floor and shelves, and even it looked bored by the events. While waiting for the robber to stalk through the aisles, I caught a glimpse of the store owner, dispassionately eating a candy bar, as if his body had just autonomously decided to provide itself with some kind of sustenance without bothering to consult his mind. I note this because it was at that exact moment that another person entered the store. The robber that, outside the box intellect, hadn't thought to lock the door in the meantime, through criminal forgetfulness or criminal confidence. The newcomer, a man who looked much too lively to be in a store like this, walked up to the counter, and I actually saw the store owner's mind boot back up. His chewing slowed, his eyes flickered. He even shook away the webs of apathy that had enmeshed his thoughts. They had a brief exchange that I could not hear, but from the nature of the man's body language, erect though relaxed, like a suburban dad walking into a home improvement store, I guessed that the store owner hadn't informed the man of the robbery in progress. The man walked away from the counter, and when his back was turned, the store owner glanced at me and gave me the most wicked, sadistically mischievous grin I'd ever seen. I realized that I had greatly underestimated the store owner's boredom. He was a man who dealt in fiction, in the fantastical, in the morbid, in the purely speculative. Reality was unbearably boring to him. Even then, in the midst of a situation most people dread to ever experience, he was having a boring time. So he must have thought, why not spice things up a bit? Add a wild card. Maybe something interesting will happen. But things certainly did get interesting. And then they became terrifying. And as you already know, agonizing. For me, at least. The man walked out of my sight, and some inner ethical impetus drove me to follow him. Thankfully, the robber was sweeping through the aisles on the opposite side of the store, and the newcomer had gone to an aisle not far from mine. I rounded the corner to find him standing in front of the store's middling fantasy collection, not that there's many good fantasy movies, with his hands in his pockets of his navy blue windbreaker. He seemed pleasantly content with his selection, eyeing them all with a wonder that I mentally noted but didn't consciously think over at the time. Looking back, it made sense for him to have been amused by them. There was no music playing in the store. Might have felt inappropriately upbeat, so I had to whisper extremely low. Still, the man heard me and nodded along in understanding of my words. He smiled, thanked me with a casualness and audibility that almost made me respond by screaming at him, then went back to browsing the fantasy flicks. The robber was eventually mindful of something. He'd noticed my absence from my designated spot. I heard him call out, "Hey!" which I knew to be directed at me, since there wasn't anyone else to hey at besides the owner, who wouldn't have deviated from his NPC-like station at the register. Before I could say anything to excuse my absence, the robber entered the aisle, shotgun poised chest level towards me. My hands went up, and the movies I'd been cradling, that I for some reason hadn't put back, fell to the floor, clattering loudly. In the following silence, I heard the store owner huff his caveman-like announcement that if I survived the ordeal, I'd be paying for those movies. The robber, in stereotypical bad guy fashion, motioned with the gun for me to step aside. I did so, revealing the still browsing patron, hands still comfortably resting in his pockets. The robber looked at me incredulously, and I returned the expression. Neither of us could believe the casualness of the guy, the amusement on his face. Finally, after allowing for as much time as any decent thug would, the robber discharged the shotgun into the shelves. The sound of the blast was interesting. I'd heard thousands of gunshots, real and simulated, conveyed through the speakers of my computer, modulated precisely to the director or editor's tastes, but none of them, not a single one, had accurately, faithfully attested to or recreated the utterly horrible, physically destabilizing effect of hearing one in person, 2 feet away, without any sort of hearing protection or warning. I hadn't actually expected this robber to use the weapon. The idea wasn't something my brain, accustomed to and tantalized by violence, had ever truly considered. We board planes anticipating cramped seats and crying children, not collisions with mountain ranges or destruction by tempestuous weather, even though we're aware of the possibilities. As if a switch had been turned off, a cord cut, my body dropped to the ground. I hadn't been shot yet, but the concussive force of the blast, the shock of the discharge, immediately reset my ultra-domestic mind. The explosion of debris did not bother me, even as shards of plastic and wood sliced past my face and chest. I stirred, I crawled, I clutched and spat, desperately trying to reorient myself and rid my body of the sudden delirium. The violence of the moment segued into screams, not all of which were mine. The voices spoke above me, one very terribly urgent, the other oddly calm, almost placating. The urgent one was familiar, although at the time I couldn't tell why, so I latched onto that one, clumsily climbed up shelves as if drugged, lurched towards the voice which I had dimly recognized and which had sounded on the verge of an insane panic. My efforts were rewarded with a sensation of flight. Well, maybe not flight in the sense of soaring, but in the sense of being bodily carried from one point in space to another. Through means unnatural to me, my flight was short-lived, and I soon found myself staring at the ceiling, with a bizarre sensation of fingers or points of some kind pressing at least 2 spots of my body, almost like acupuncture. The sensation intensified, focused on those 2 points until they became epicenters of 2 great sites of impact. Then, what had been combined sensations of warmth and pressure suddenly became locations of mind-unraveling agony, and I at least realized that I had been shot. My ears still rang, and my vision was still frustratingly blurred, so the second blast hadn't altered my perceptions much more. The force of it, imperceptible at the time of impact, reared itself in the heat and pressure and pain afterwards, in my body's delayed reaction manifested consummately, excruciatingly. If you want to know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a thankfully non-fatal shotgun blast, I suggest finding an answer to a more worthwhile inquiry. It's not something you can shrug off or grit through or cry out. There aren't any safely achievable parallel sensations. I wasn't even shot at directly. The gunman hadn't meant to shoot me, and I luckily had been far enough away from the actual target to merely be brushed aside by the volley. And yet, it is by far the most unpleasant sensation I'd ever experienced. I was given a crash course in how hilariously unprepared the human body is for events of physical trauma. So, lying here, gazing up at the ceiling as if my insides felt like they were liquefying and my lungs fought against some indomitable nothing to suck in air, I heard more interesting things through the tinnitus-inducing ringing. The voice, which had been on the verge of panicking, was now panicking. The person from whom it issued cried awfully, which I found odd since I had finally connected the voice with the gunman. This voice, this long, sustained cry, was suddenly cut short and replaced by a sound that was a mix of a tree branch being snapped and a great wet heap of something falling upon the dense carpet. As the agony deepened, my disorientation lessened, and I managed to tilt my head up, an effort that felt Herculean, given the pain, and look ahead of me. What I saw somewhat lessened my body-spinning pain as my brain was suddenly tasked with interpreting the bizarre visual imagery, temporarily placing the pain on a cognitive backburner. It was a physically taxing process, trying to make sense of the ultra-violent scene when I saw what I knew to be the gunman, but positioned, displayed in a way that I hadn't ever seen a man displayed before. He was separated from himself, torn, with his insides dangling loosely, gruesomely, right down to the floor. The steaming heap of entrails had been the wet sound I'd heard earlier. The breaking of the man's skeletal structure had been the branch-like sound. The two halves of this man's body were connected solely through the slimy tangle of innards. Everything else had been savagely separated. Holding both halves as if posing with two recently caught fish before a camera was the man who'd been fascinated with the fantasy films. His windbreaker had been spattered with blood and his shoes covered in gore. His face still held a look of amusement, which I found even more unsettling than the sundered man his hands held. The shotgun lay beneath the hovering halves, a loose strand of intestines draped over it. The carpet was covered in the shards of the movie cases and the media they contained, where it wasn't covered by the remains of the man. I took all this in, this great, gruesome scene, in a matter of seconds, then began screaming insanely, the only action my mind could think to do in response to the grisliness. Forgetting that I'd been shot, I crawled backwards, intuiting that the gunman's death, the manner of his death, had changed circumstances, and not for my benefit. You see, after arriving at the decision to command my lungs and vocal cords to muster up a scream, my mind hastily conjured another slightly more coherent thought. Supposition, really. And it was this, that the man, who was plainly not human, would now murder me, since I had witnessed an exhibition of this inhuman capability. It was, after all, how many similar, albeit fictional circumstances had played out in movies and shows I often rented from the store. This man's almost obnoxiously ordinary attire was a clear indication that he desired to uphold an appearance of normalcy. Ripping apart a man in a video store is the antithesis of that intention, so to assume that this act would not be reported and that his normalcy publicly discontinued, he would have to rip apart another man. Me. I hadn't thought to plead with him. It wasn't out of the belief that to do so would be futile. I was just stupidly, irreconcilably terrified. The man, seeing me inching away, dropped the two halves of the gunman and walked towards me, the casualness of his stride, the nonchalance of his expression, inspired the blackest, deepest horror within me. I froze. A condemned deer in the excruciating highlights, unable to do anything but breathlessly gawk at the approaching entity. Clearly not a human. He stood over me, blood streaking down his windbreaker, and extended a hand. I recoiled physically and spiritually, expecting it to close around my throat, lift me up, longitudinally bisect me like a piece of paper. But the man did not reach closer than just a few inches from my face, and the fingers remained relaxed, non-threatening. Finally understanding the intended gesture, but still horrified by what might follow it, I tentatively extended my own hand. The two members met, with the higher form around the lower. Gently, courteously, the man lifted me to my feet, mindful of the trauma that had been dealt to my body. He gave me a warm smile, and I don't mean figuratively. Like, there was a physically palpable warmth that emitted from the expression, a warmth whose radiance was oddly restorative. I felt the pain of my wounds lessen. The wounds themselves did not miraculously heal, but I was given the ability, imparted the fortitude, to handle them with something that approached comfort. Without consciously commanding my lips to, I found myself thanking the stranger. He nodded. He turned away, but stopped. I first thought it was to sidestep the mess that he'd made of the other man, but he instead turned back to me and said, "These aren't very accurate," whilst gesturing broadly to the scattered remains of the various fantasy films. Stupidly allowing my curiosity to get the better of me, I asked what he meant. The thought forming in my head that the stranger was truly some fantastical creature in disguise, and therefore an authority on the authenticity of depictions of the fantastic. No amount of creativity, no amount of outside-the-box thinking could have allowed me to imagine what the man showed me. He smiled, unzipped his windbreaker, shook away the grisly debris, and placed it atop a shelf. He then held up his hand with his palm facing me, intimating that I should either stand back or prepare myself for something. I took a step back and tried to steel myself against the sight of something that I couldn't have ever anticipated seeing. He then transformed. Well, not completely, only his torso and head. The legs remained human, probably just because he hadn't wanted to remove his pants. The portions revealed to me were enough to carry his point, though. The head would have been enough. There was something simultaneously divine and yet obscene about the thing that he partially morphed into. The overall morphology, if it had been completed, would have been utterly alien to the human form. The head collapsed in upon itself, and from the heap a new thing blossomed. Though whether or not it served the same cephalic purpose, I can't say. The chest unraveled, the skin of it, that is, and several things burst forth. I'm hesitant to call them organs because that suggests a purpose of physiological function. And these projections, these buds, they might have been naturally grown ornamentation or armor. It is possible to apply human characteristics to these supernaturally inhuman individuals. But these chest growths were varied in color, not even stagnant in their individual coloring. They glowed luminously, iridescently, like bioluminescent bulbs. The shoulders and arms extended, widened, contorted, becoming wing-like appendages, though they all also seemed to serve some sort of sensory purpose, which I judged by the way they gravitated towards me. The stomach bulged inordinately and then became transparent, revealing a dazzling microcosm of spectral life within, some kind of photic pregnancy. The whole structure, but to call it a body would be a pathetically human thing to do. It was both nightmarish and regal, a blessedly appalling sight that simultaneously chilled and spiritually exonerated my soul. It was beatrific bastardization of what had once been, or appeared to be, a human body. When it spoke, I was seized and disheartened by an inestimable, dreadful horror. No terrestrial entity, nothing born of the known elements within the mapped universe could have produced this exocosmic, abysmal sound, and yet, beneath the awfulness of its abyss-deep tones, there was a paradoxically Empyrean timbre, as if within the blackly sonorous voice piped the trumpets of a heavenly choir. Stupidly, not really understanding anything beyond that, I was less than nothing compared to this being. I asked, "Are you an angel?" The doubtedly intoned voice responded, "I am no angel than you are, my friend. At my highest station, I am Intresser, an entity through which you may convey your concerns and prayers. I kneel before the prime beings, as they kneel before the prime beings." With that, the stranger resumed his human appearance in a physical de-evolution and heroic dissipation that was even more unsettling because I knew what it had been, and it seemed almost perverse for the human body to contain something so wondrously, terrifyingly grand. When his human body had fully reconstructed, the man put on his windbreaker and walked away. Mechanically, mind numbed by the awesome showcase, I followed him. But by the time I exited the aisle, he was gone from the store. The store owner rose from a crouched position behind the register, presumably having cowered at the sound of the first gunshot. He looked at me, funnily, and I remembered that I was covered in blood. I looked down, meaning to wipe away any substantial crumbs of the gunman that clung to my clothing, but instead, I saw the bare front of my chest and stomach, and other lower region also exposed. On my shoes, instead of bloodstains, there were ashen smears. I turned and went back to the aisle, and instead of steaming human remains, I saw a scattering of ashes and scorched carpet. It took a moment for the realization of what had occurred to set in, but when it did, it brought back a fresh horror and beneath that, a melancholy born of recognition of my cosmic insignificance. The mere partial transformation into the sub-angelic being's true form had generated an immense heat, which had blasted the ashes, the sundered corpse of the gunman, and burnt away the front of my clothing. The raw, sheer power exuded by the entity was deeply humbling, and I shook uncontrollably as I returned to the store owner. I told him that I was going to the hospital, and to direct the police there if they were not immediately contacted by the hospital staff due to the nature of my wounds. Half naked, skin singed, I walked away from the video store that I would never return to because in only a moment I had my fill of the strange, of the fantastical, and of the horribly, nightmarishly macabre. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. It really helps me out whenever you guys do things like listen or watch. And it really helps if you guys also subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel, or do things like clicking the bell or clicking the like button. For those of you who are looking to actually talk to me live and not just listen to me on the podcast or the live stream or what have you, then you can actually head over to twitch.tv/MrCreepyPasta, where I record a lot of these episodes that you see live. Also, it's just fun for me to be able to interact with you guys, and sometimes we do other fun games. And as always, I want to give a very special thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. You guys are the ones who help me keep the lights on in the house, as well as allow me to do things like commission brand new stories. In case you guys haven't noticed, we hit that tier. So, a very special thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stricken, Chase Burnett, Deanna Kraus, G Weevil 3, Tristan Pelton, 1-800-Nightmare, Acid System, Aaron Stormcrow, Azurine Fox, Bobby Karman, Chris Lovins, Cryptic Nightmares, The Doctor, Daniel Polson, Dr. Stein and Mr. Happy, Eurogore, Freddy Krueger, Fried Chicken 12, Hades Nephew, InfernalOne, James Bruce, James Lowe, Jason VR Wilson, JimboTheHutt, Jordan Nells, Jordan Johnson, Caleb Dougal, Kiri the Sloth, Legit Quad Feed, Liam Newman, Lisa Cottrell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Michael Scharbrough, Nico Kaio, Nina Smith, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Rafael Rodriguez, Robert White, S-Man, Sky Harbor, Snails Burnett, Talon Karlik, The Ginger Bros, Trace Miles, Tsuji Campbell, Tynannie, Unknown Nobody, Andre Garcia, Brianna Wright, Brian Ace, Caspian, Hogunkji, and Someone You Love. And also a very special thank you to everybody who's down there in the description down below. below. All you guys who are listed as Patreons and everybody who's even supporting for just $1, I really love and appreciate you guys. And if you want to join them, you can always head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. Even $1 a month, honestly, it keeps the show going. So thank you guys so much. And to everyone out there, sweet dreams.